The old library nestled on a quiet street in Queen Anne was more than just a job for Venus Moore. It was her sanctuary. The scent of old pages and wood polish, the way sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, the hush that demanded reverence. All of it made her feel like the world hadn't quite collapsed yet. At 27, Venus had learned to live between borrowed time and borrowed dreams. Her days were filled with overdue notices, whispered goodbyes to her mother's fading health, and dinners that came in microwavable trays. The laughter she once carried so easily had grown quiet, buried beneath worry and exhaustion. Still, each morning, she arrived at the library 15 minutes early, unlocking its iron gate like it was a secret passage to somewhere softer. Her fingers, rough from shelving books and scrubbing secondhand tile, lingered lovingly on worn leather covers and embossed spines. Literature was her last thread to a world where things ended well. That morning, the rain was relentless, drumming gently against the arch windows. Venus wrapped her faded burgundy cardigan tighter around her as she rearranged a crooked display of poetry, anthologies left askew by high school students the day before. She didn't notice the man standing in the philosophy aisle, not at first. He stood still, too still, not browsing, not searching, just watching. When Venus finally looked up and met his eyes, something in her paused. The man wore a dark overcoat still damp with Seattle rain, his expression unreadable but intense, like he had come searching for something he wasn't sure existed. And somehow she already knew. This would be the day everything changed. Venus didn't usually notice her patrons, not in the way that made time still. But this man, this stranger in the long charcoal coat with water still dripping from its hem, held a kind of presence that pulled the air taut around him. "Can I help you find something?" she asked gently, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. He looked at her as if she had asked the wrong question. "Actually," he said, voice smooth but low, "I think I may have already found it." She blinked. "Excuse me?" He offered a half smile, something not quite polite, not quite disarming. "I'm Julian Blake," he said, reaching into his coat and handing her a business card. Thick, matte black, embossed with silver. She didn't need to read the fine print to know who he was. Even from a distance, the name meant something. Venus had heard of him. Who hadn't? The tech prodigy turned tycoon who made his billions building artificial intelligence platforms and streamlining human inefficiencies out of existence. Brilliant, brutal, unreachable. So what was someone like him doing in her library? "I know this will sound unconventional," Julian continued, lowering his voice, "but I have a proposition, one I think only you can fulfill." Venus stiffened, instinct warning her to keep distance. "What kind of proposition?" "A performance," he said simply. "I need someone to pretend to be my wife. For 7 days." She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Is this a joke?" "I'm serious." He was, deadly so. Julian stepped closer, not threatening, but insistent. "There's a corporate merger happening, a big one. International investors and regulatory boards are watching every move. They expect a stable image, someone who doesn't just run numbers, but has roots, balance, love. And you think hiring a stranger to play your wife screams stability?" she asked, folding her arms. "No," he said, pausing, "but the right stranger just might." Her heart beat faster, an anxious flutter she tried to control. "Why me?" "You offered a cup of tea to an unhoused man outside this morning," he replied as if that were enough. "You didn't look away. You didn't hesitate. You saw a human being when no one else even stopped. That kind of compassion can't be taught." Venus swallowed hard. He placed a second card on the desk, this one bearing an address. $50,000, Julian added, all expenses covered. No physical expectations, just events, appearances, and the illusion of shared history. Her hands trembled. That number, it was almost 2 years of salary, enough to cover her mother's surgery, enough to breathe. Julian met her gaze. You don't have to answer now. If you're interested, be at that address by 8 a.m. tomorrow. If not, he turned toward the door, then paused. I won't bother you again. As he walked out into the rain, his voice lingered like a storm in retreat. Thank you for being the kind of person the world still needs. And then he was gone, leaving only a glistening trail of raindrops and the weight of an impossible choice. That night, Venus sat alone in her apartment, bare walls, flickering heater, and 2 business cards on her lap. By morning, she already knew her answer. At exactly 7:55 a.m., Venus stood in front of a wrought iron gate, its elegant black bars curling like vines. The address on Julian's card had led her to an exclusive hilltop neighborhood just outside Seattle, where the air smelled of pine and wealth. She adjusted the strap of her second-hand satchel and tried not to fidget in her worn-out sneakers. Her entire life fit inside one modest suitcase, which now looked painfully out of place next to the manicured hedges and cobblestone path. She pressed the call button beside the gate. Venus Moore, she said softly, unsure whether she was announcing herself or reminding herself that she still existed. The gate opened with a smooth, mechanical sigh. As she walked up the stone path lined with hydrangeas and Japanese maples, the house loomed ahead, a masterpiece of modern architecture and quiet arrogance. Glass walls, slate roofs, sharp lines. It looked like the kind of place where no one ever raised their voice. At the entrance, a man in a tailored black suit greeted her. Silver at his temples, posture military straight. He looked like he belonged in a film. Miss Moore, he said with a small bow. I'm Samuel, Mr. Blake's estate manager. May I take your luggage? Before she could respond, he had already lifted her suitcase as if it were made of feathers. Inside, the house was breathtaking. Wide open spaces, white oak floors, soft ambient lighting. A spiral staircase curved like a sculpture in the center of the atrium. Art hung on the walls, originals no doubt, and the faint scent of citrus and cedar filled the air. Samuel guided her to a sitting room where a tall woman waited, arms crossed, heels tapping against polished marble. Her hair was platinum blonde, swept into a flawless bun, and her eyes were the color of winter glass. Margot Leclerc, the woman said, her French accent as sharp as her cheekbones. Etiquette, posture, wardrobe, language. You'll learn it all. If not, you'll ruin everything. Venus blinked. Excuse me? Margot walked around her slowly as if sizing up a mannequin. Good bone structure, poor wardrobe choices, hair with potential, posture salvageable. I'm not here to be salvaged, Venus said under her breath. Margot smiled coldly. You are here to be transformed, darling. The world Mr. Blake lives in is brutal. Every glance matters. Every smile must be calculated. You're not just playing his wife. You're becoming her. The door behind them opened. Julian walked in. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at Venus. Really looked. She was still in her thrift store jeans and oversized cardigan, but something in his eyes flickered. A pause, a softness. Then, as if remembering who he was supposed to be, he nodded. You came. I said I would. Margot turned to him. She'll need a full day. Facial, hair, dress fitting, posture correction. Julian interrupted. Be kind. Margot raised an eyebrow. I'm always kind, eventually. As Venus followed her down the hallway, she glanced back once. Julian was still watching her, and though his face was unreadable, she could have sworn she saw it. The beginning of something human in a man made of logic. The dress was nothing like Venus had ever worn. Ivory silk, bare shoulders, a neckline that whispered elegance, not exposure. The fabric clung softly to her frame, moving like water when she walked. Her hair had been swept into a classic updo, soft tendrils left free to frame her face. a touch of red gloss on her lips, just enough to say she belonged in the room she was about to enter. Julian waited for her at the bottom of the grand staircase. Black tuxedo, crisp lines, control in every inch of his frame, except for his eyes, which lifted the moment she appeared. He froze. His phone slipped from his hand and landed on the marble floor with a muted clatter. Venus descended slowly, her heartbeat louder than the soft music echoing from the car waiting outside. "Is the plan still intact?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian's jaw clenched, but then he nodded, eyes never leaving her. "You look stunning." The word held weight, reverence even. The charity gala was held at the Seattle Museum of Art, an opulent affair bathed in crystal lighting and curated conversations. As their car pulled up to the entrance, cameras flashed like a summer storm. Julian stepped out first, offering his hand. Venus hesitated for only a breath before taking it. Their hands touched, silk glove against bare skin, and something passed between them. Electricity, a question with no answer. "Just smile slightly," Julian murmured as they stepped onto the carpet. "And look at me like I'm your entire world." "And how will you look at me?" she asked, stealing a glance up at him. He paused. "Like you're the only thing keeping me human." Inside the museum, everything gleamed. Gold, glass, and people dressed in ambition. Venus felt like she'd walked into someone else's dream, but Julian's hand remained on the small of her back, grounding her, steady. She hadn't expected to enjoy it, but she did. That is, until she arrived. Vivienne Hart. She floated into the room in a black velvet gown, her platinum hair pulled into a sleek chignon, red lips curved into something far from warm. On her arm was a man twice her age, one of Julian's business rivals, the perfect accessory to complete her signature weapon, presence. "Julian?" Vivienne cooed, approaching like a cat sizing up prey. "You didn't mention you'd gotten married." Venus stiffened, but Julian's hand tightened around hers. "We had a quiet ceremony," Venus said calmly before Julian could speak. "He doesn't like noise." Vivienne tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "How quaint. When we were together, he never minded noise." Venus didn't flinch. "Maybe he's finally learning peace." The jab landed. Vivienne's smile faltered, just slightly. "You have no idea who you're talking to." "Oh, I think I do," Venus replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "The woman who belongs to my husband's past." Julian turned toward Venus then, his gaze not cool or collected, but alive. Something had cracked open, and in that moment, as the crowd began to whisper, he placed a hand on the small of her back and said, "If you'll excuse us, I'd like to dance with my wife." The orchestra had shifted into a slow Viennese waltz as Julian led her to the dance floor. Venus's hand slid into his, the other settling on his shoulder. "You're perfect," he murmured as they began to move. "You saw what she tried to do." "She hurt you," Venus replied, her eyes on his. "I saw it." His breath caught. "Why are you defending me?" "Because," she said, her voice trembling, "because tonight you're my husband. Even if it's pretend, right now it feels real." Julian stopped for a beat, just enough for the rhythm to slip. "Venus," he whispered, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. "You're making this too hard." "Too hard to remember it's fake?" she asked. He didn't answer, because they both knew. There was nothing fake about the way his hand pressed gently against her back. Nothing fake in the way her breath hitched when he looked at her, like she was the only real thing in the room. The music swelled. They moved together, not as strangers, not as actors, but as two people who no longer remembered where the performance ended. And in that golden, echoing hall filled with polished lies and curated appearances, something entirely unplanned had just begun. The gala faded behind them like a half-remembered dream. Julian didn't speak on the drive home, and Venus didn't press. Something had shifted, quietly but undeniably, and neither of them seemed ready to name it. Back at the estate, the house was dim and silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood and the hum of distant rain against glass. Venus didn't return to her guest room. Instead, she wandered past the kitchen, through the glass doors, and stepped barefoot into the garden. A cobblestone path led down to a private lake tucked behind a veil of cedar trees, still as glass under the night sky. She found the bench by the water's edge and sat, heels in hand, toes curling into the cold grass. The air smelled of pine and earth, and moonlight danced across the water in quiet ripples. Just for a moment, she let her shoulders drop. Let herself be not Mrs. Blake, but Venus Moore. Just a girl, tired and honest and full of questions. She didn't hear him approach, but his presence was unmistakable. Julian stepped from the shadows like a man pulled by gravity. Jacket off, tie undone, sleeves rolled up. His footsteps slowed as he neared her. "You left early," he said quietly. "I needed air." He didn't sit, just stood a few feet away, unsure whether he was welcome. Venus looked at the lake. "It's beautiful here." "Quiet." "Too quiet," Julian said, his voice barely audible. "Some nights I hate the silence. Feels like it's accusing me." She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw not the mogul or the strategist, but a man still at war with himself. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "All this pretending?" He hesitated, then sat beside her. "Because real things fall apart. I've seen it. I've lived it. And I thought, if I kept everything in my control, I couldn't lose anything." "But that's not living, Julian," she said softly. "That's surviving." He turned to her. "And what about you, Venus? You think you're not pretending? You carry the weight of the world in your eyes and still smile like it's light." The words hit harder than she expected. "I'm not pretending," she said, voice quiet but fierce. "I'm enduring. There's a difference." He looked at her then, longer than he should have, as if every carefully built wall inside him cracked just enough to let something dangerous through. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. She didn't, so he leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, two people hovering on the edge of something neither of them had expected. But then she sighed, and he broke. His hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, deeper, until it wasn't a kiss anymore. It was a surrender. When they finally pulled away, both breathless, their foreheads pressed together in silence. "This wasn't part of the plan," Venus whispered. Julian didn't answer right away. "I know," he said, voice rough. "That's what scares me." The next morning, sunlight filtered gently through the sheer curtains, casting golden lines across the guest room walls. Venus stirred, lips still tingling from the night before. For a few precious seconds, she let herself believe it had all been real. Then came the knock. Julian entered, already dressed in his usual armor. Starched shirt, polished shoes, eyes distant. He set a cup of coffee on the side table, careful not to meet her gaze. "About last night," he began. The warmth in her chest flickered. Julian took a breath. "It was a mistake." Venus sat up slowly, the words sinking like ice into her lungs. "I see. I crossed a line," he continued, voice clipped. "We both did. This is a contract, nothing more." She nodded, too calm for how loud her heart had started beating. "Of course. I can't afford for this to get complicated," he added, though his voice faltered on the last word. "There's too much at stake." Venus didn't respond. She simply reached for the coffee, her hand trembling slightly. Silence filled the space between them, deep and cold. Julian turned to leave but paused at the door. "You were convincing," Last night. Thank you, she said, each syllable sharp, measured. The door clicked shut behind him. Only then did she let her breath shake. That afternoon, Venus curled up in the estate's library, a book open but unread in her lap. Her mind looped through his words. Mistake, contract, nothing more, until they etched themselves onto her skin. She didn't notice the footsteps until they stopped just behind her. Clinging to fairy tales? A voice drawled. Venus looked up. Vivienne. She stood like she owned the room, a silk blouse hugging her frame, lips painted the color of blood and conquest. I just thought, Vivienne said smoothly, you should know. Julian was engaged to me for 5 years. I'm the only woman he's ever loved. Venus kept her voice steady. And you think he's using me to forget you? Vivienne's smile was all venom. Isn't he? Venus stood, not defensive, not afraid, but raw. Get out, she said quietly. Vivienne leaned in, whispering like a dagger. You're a nobody, Venus. Don't confuse gratitude with love. As the door closed behind her, Venus didn't cry, but something inside her cracked, not because of Vivienne, but because Julian hadn't stopped her. Union Station was nearly empty. The echoes of departing trains whispered across the marble floors, like ghosts of choices not yet made. Venus sat on a wooden bench near Platform 6, her small suitcase tucked at her feet, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were dry, but her chest ached with something far heavier than grief: finality. She had told herself this was the right thing, that walking away from someone who had made her feel temporary was the only way to reclaim her own worth. And yet, as the station clock ticked toward midnight, she couldn't move. Not yet. Not until she could convince herself she was truly ready to forget him. Then she heard it, running footsteps, unsteady, urgent. Venus! She turned just in time to see Julian, coat open, tie forgotten, breathless. His eyes scanned the station wildly until they landed on her, and for a second, the world stilled. He crossed the space between them in a rush, stopping only inches away. You can't leave, he said, voice rough with emotion. Not like this. Venus stood, her voice small. Julian, it's over. The 7 days are done. There's no reason to pretend anymore. I'm not pretending. He took a breath that trembled on the way out. I haven't been pretending since the moment you walked down those stairs in that white dress. She shook her head, willing herself not to hope. It was just a contract. Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a velvet box. He dropped to one knee, right there in the middle of the quiet terminal. It was never just a contract, he said, his voice breaking. It started that way, but everything changed. You changed me. And now I can't imagine my life without you in it. Not as a role, not as an illusion, as you. Venus stared, heart racing. No more pretending, Julian said. No more timelines, no expectations. Just this, just us. Will you marry me, Venus Moore? Silence stretched around them like a held breath. Then she let it out, a soft laugh choked by tears. You're insane, she whispered. He smiled, still kneeling. Only for you. She dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face with both hands. Yes, she breathed. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The station didn't erupt in applause. No petals fell from the ceiling. But in that quiet, echoing place, something louder than thunder had happened. Two hearts had chosen each other, without script, without stage. Only truth, and it was enough. Julian didn't take Venus back to the estate that night. Instead, they drove north, away from the city lights, past winding forest roads and fog-kissed trees. They didn't speak much. There was a softness to the silence between them now, no longer filled with fear or pretending, but something gentler, understanding. When they arrived, Venus stared out the window, surprised. A small lakeside cabin stood under a canopy of cedar trees. Weathered wood, white shutters, a porch swaying in the night breeze. The opposite of everything Julian Blake was known for. And yet, it felt real. "This was my mother's place," Julian said, voice low. "I haven't been here in years, but tonight I didn't want glass walls and marble floors. I wanted something that still remembers how to breathe." Venus stepped inside. The scent of old pine and dried lavender lingered in the air. Books lined the walls. A worn sofa hugged the fireplace. The kitchen counters bore tiny coffee stains that hadn't been scrubbed into oblivion. It was a place where time moved slowly, where the world didn't demand performance. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Julian lit the fireplace, then sat across from her, the flickering light softening every angle of his face. He looked different here, unguarded, almost boyish. "I'm scared," Venus admitted, eyes tracing the flames. "So am I," Julian said. "I've never loved the right way before. But I want to try, if you'll let me." Venus nodded, her heart aching in the best way. "Only if we build it from the quiet parts, from the mornings without makeup and the nights without pretending." A small smile tugged at his lips. "That's all I've ever wanted." In the days that followed, they did everything slowly. They made breakfast side by side, walked barefoot in the wet grass, read in comfortable silence. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours, but their silences were never empty. They were full of meaning, of presence, of beginnings. There were no cameras, no deadlines, only two people relearning how to live together. After a week of quiet mornings and honest beginnings by the lake, the noise of the world returned. But this time, Venus didn't fear it. Julian held her hand as they stepped out of the black car in front of the Seattle Regent Hotel. Flash bulbs exploded around them, but neither of them blinked. This was Blake Tech's annual gala, its most public, most scrutinized event of the year. The last time they'd entered a ballroom like this, everything had been performance. Now every step was real. Venus wore a sleek black gown, simple, elegant, unapologetically her. Julian hadn't hired a stylist. She hadn't rehearsed lines. And yet, as they walked through the crowd, no one could look away. Inside, the room shimmered with wealth and influence. Conversations rose and fell like rehearsed music. But Julian didn't let go of her hand. "Are you ready?" he asked, voice low. Venus nodded. More than ever. Then came the inevitable, Vivian Hart. She glided toward them, a crimson dress hugging her frame like a warning, the same practiced smile on her lips, the same eyes scanning for weakness. "Well," she said smoothly, "the performance continues." Venus smiled, small but unshaken. "Not anymore." Vivian blinked. "No clever lines tonight?" "No need," Venus replied. "I'm not here to win. I'm just here." Before Vivian could speak again, Julian glanced at Venus, her eyes calm, unshaken. Then, as if something inside him finally aligned, he stepped forward toward the front of the room. A hush followed, thick with anticipation, as he took the stage. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," he began, voice even, "but some truths deserve to be said aloud." He looked straight at Venus. "A while ago, I brought someone into my life for reasons that weren't entirely honest. It started as a performance, a calculated solution. But what I found in her was not calculation. It was clarity." The room was utterly silent now. "She's not here tonight because of a role. She's here because she is the only truth I want in my life. Not for business, not for image, just because she's her." Julian paused. "I choose Venus more, not as a partner in a plan, but as the woman I love." The applause thundered like a storm finally released. Venus didn't rush. She walked slowly, deliberately toward the man who had stopped hiding. No script, no mask, just love, finally spoken aloud. 3 months later, under a sky brushed with early autumn gold, Venus walked barefoot across the soft grass of a lakeside garden. The same lake where Julian had first kissed her, scared and unsure, and where she had let him in anyway. She wore a simple lace dress, no veil, no diamonds. In her hands, a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself that morning. Every detail was hers, every choice real. Julian stood beneath a wooden arch wrapped in ivy, wearing a navy suit and a smile that held none of the armor he used to wear. There were no reporters, no investors, no audience except for a few people who truly mattered. Samuel, Margot, and a quiet woman from the library who had once covered for Venus when her mother fell ill. When their eyes met, nothing else existed. No corporate gala, no contract, no performance. Just this. Two people who had chosen each other over and over again, even when it was hard. Julian took her hands and whispered, "You saved me." Venus smiled, eyes shining. "No, we found each other, and we stopped pretending." Their vows were quiet, unrehearsed, spoken from the heart with all the imperfections that made them beautiful. No stage, no spectacle, just truth. And when they kissed, it wasn't the kind that ends a fairy tale. It was the kind that begins a life. Because real love doesn't need perfect timing, or polished words, or a script. It only needs two hearts brave enough to say, "This is real, and I'm staying."